It gives me enormous pleasure to welcome Charlie MacCormack back to Middlebury College. He's one of Middlebury College's most accomplished alums and does a lot of good in the world and a lot of good for Middlebury College. He started as a pre-med major and graduated with a degree in English. He went on, he had a great change of heart and realized, what was really worth studying. So he went on to earn a PhD in political science. That's my field, so I'm allowed to say that. From Columbia University, and along the way served as a National Science Foundation Fellow in Mexico City, as a Fulbright Fellow in Caracas, Venezuela, and as a Research Fellow in Foreign Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution. Dr. MacCormack is currently President, Chief Executive Officer, and a member of the Board of Directors of Save the Children Federation, Inc. With programs in 18 states, in the United States, and in over 40 countries overseas, an annual budget over $200 million, and more than 2,500 staff members worldwide, Save the Children works to make lasting positive differences in the lives of disadvantaged children by implementing programs that focus on primary health care, microenterprise, and basic education. Save the Children, as many of you know, also supports refugee assistance programs around the world and provides humanitarian assistance worldwide. Dr. MacCormack was president of World Learning, previously known as the Experiment in International Living, in Brattleboro, Vermont, from 1977 to 1992. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Executive Committee of Interaction, the Advisory Committee on Voluntary Foreign Aid, and the Food Security Advisory Committee. He has previously served as president of the Non-Governmental Committee on UNICEF and was selected by the United Nations Secretary General to participate in the founding of the United Nations University. He served as a member of a range of important delegations, including the United States delegation to the World Food Summit and the United States delegation to the Preparatory Committee for the 2001 General Assembly special session on children. And I know you've been flying around the world to many other summits that put you in contact with people like Bono, among others, so you can enlighten us on those other activities. I'm sure our students would like to know about that association in particular. He's going to speak today on a topic of extraordinary importance. The title is Making Poverty History, Slogan, or Reality. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Charlie MacCormack.
Thank you, Allison, very much, and thank you for arranging a gray day with a 45-degree temperature, because if Middlebury was anything like it was when I was here in April and it was 70 degrees and sunny, there wouldn't have been many of us who would have turned out. But I'm glad that you have, whether it was because of the weather or otherwise. Actually, as Allison said, until I was a junior here, I was a biochemistry major. Middlebury was as far away from my home in Greater Boston as I had been. And I was planning on going on to medical school and probably staying within 100 miles of home. And at that time, at least, Middlebury had a week in April, not unlike this month, where you have a whole series of interventions on the Millennium Development Goals and making poverty history. But that year, 1962, the third week of April, again, as I started off the month in physics and calculus and organic chemistry and so on, we had the week devoted to Africa and the future of Africa. Now, at that time, 90% of the people of Africa were still governed by French and British and Portuguese administrators, but the activities to arrange for independence were by and large underway in a great many countries, and certainly over my time at Columbia, every month or two, another African country and often another Asian country would achieve its independence. And it was a very exciting time actually to be at Columbia because the big foundations had funded 300 African future leaders to be at Columbia to study law and political science and medicine and so on and so forth. So the university was full of people who would in fact over the past decades be the leaders of Africa. But one of the speakers was a professor at the Maxwell School at Syracuse University named Eduardo Mondlane. And he was not so much a professor at Syracuse as the chief executive of the Mozambique Liberation Front. And he had been exiled by the Portuguese government and leadership and had come to the United States and was teaching, but he continued to be the leader of the Mozambique Liberation Front and was very much out of the Nelson Mandela mode, really almost a superhuman figure. And 3 years later, he was murdered by the Portuguese Secret Service. So it turned out to be a real tragedy, and the world lost a really wonderful, wonderful person. I suspect the history of Mozambique would have been different had he survived. And blessedly, I've been able to actually stay in touch with his wife and family, and I see them every year or so in Mozambique. So the relationship has continued. But there was a seminar, a part of the whole deal with these visiting faculty was that they would give talks like this, and then they would do seminars. And so he did one on African liberation, and there were 15 or so of us who sat in on that for that week. And his argument and main position was that these issues of global equity, communications, and really solidarity would be the great issues of my lifetime, and all our lifetimes who were sitting in that seminar room in 1962. And as it happened, kind of separately, I was getting less excited about my physics labs anyway. So it was going to be, if it hadn't been this, I suspect it would have been something else. But in a certain sense, whether it was karma or a blessing or luck, that message, that this set of issues would be the great issues of my lifetime, made all this, really kind of was a paradigm shift, made all the sense in the world. And so I did decide I would change majors and change my graduate school plans, and that I would devote my life and career to issues of international development and poverty alleviation. Now, at one level, what did I know really at age 20? And that it would turn out to have been the right course. But now, lo these many years later, I will say, number one, it is even more true for me that these issues of extending the blessings we all have to others, for me, has been what I was meant to do. And I would say, overall this time, there hasn't been a day when I haven't got up in the morning excited about what I would be doing that day, and that I haven't gone to bed in the evening feeling good about what happened during that day. And for those of you who will stay around at 1:30 for the career piece, I'll talk a little bit more about why that's the case and sort of the content of doing this work. but in a simple sense, I think having a purpose that you believe in and working on it with people you love and enjoy, and spending your time in challenging ways is whatever your calling is what you would want your calling to be about. And obviously international development is not the only meaningful thing to do in life, and I would also say each one of us should find what we love and care about, and that can be a whole range of good and important things. In any case, the subject that was advertised was not what have I done for the past 4 decades, but is making poverty history a slogan and myth, or is it a reality and an achievable goal? And in terms of that slogan, I did go to the G8 summit last year in Gleneagles by way of London with Bono and George Clooney and Bill Gates and the Virgin Airlines CEO, what's his name? Richard Branson, right. And they are great people, so I can tell you they're a lot of fun. They drink a lot, stay up all night. But they also actually are really committed and motivated, and are in this for the long haul. So it was a great all-night flight on Sir Richard's private jet. But when we landed in London, all over the city, and literally all the way across Westminster Cathedral were these giant banners that said "Make Poverty History." And then when we got to Edinburgh, all the way across Edinburgh Castle, in every church were giant banners, "Make Poverty History." And we had all had the Live 8 concerts that day. We had the Live 8 concert in Philadelphia, and we then flew out to London, and then they had the concerts in London and Edinburgh. And at the Virgin Air sort of terminal, they had 30 different newspapers, from Germany, from Japan, from the United States, et cetera, et cetera. And the entire front page of all the European newspapers, from top to bottom, was on these events and the G8 and making poverty history. And all the American newspapers had to go into the 8th page to find out that any of this had happened. So before I even got on the airplane, it really was clear that sort of whatever else, how the Europeans look at these issues and the importance to them of these issues and how we Americans in general look at them is night and day. And it is a page 1 story in most of Europe, and it is a page 8 story here in the U.S. But it was certainly inspiring for me to really, for actually, in a certain sense, with all these years, the first time in my life to be in an environment, this was London and Edinburgh at that time, where everyone, the masses, were actually interested in the Millennium Development Goals, knew what they were informed about what needed to happen, and for whom it was one of the 2 or 3 major political priorities. So whatever else, when you're in something that's going to take a long time to achieve, and that goal is not on everyone else's mind, it is a very nice experience to have a moment when every wall is plastered with your story and every person is interested in what you're doing. Now, it didn't hurt that Bono and Bob Geldof and all these people were also all there, but beyond that, they were also there because people really cared about the issues. And so that phrase, making poverty history, was everywhere. And that was the brand for the global campaign about achieving the Millennium Development Goals, and it was the campaigning slogan in Europe, and also obviously kind of the focal message for the G8 prime ministers and presidents. We didn't have that campaign at all here in the United States. Hasn't existed, doesn't exist. And Save the Children, by the way, I'm the CEO of Save the Children US, and there are 28 other Save the Children's in the Federation. Save the Children Japan, Save the Children Italy, Save the Children Spain, Save the Children Switzerland, Save the Children France. And I run the U.S. member, and then I have counterparts in all these other countries. And they had proposed at our quarterly meetings that we all make this campaign, Make Poverty History, our global campaign for 2005. And I said, well, we're not going to do it in the U.S. because you couldn't, sell Make Poverty History to Americans for love or money. It's too abstract for Americans. And I believe it is too abstract for Americans. And in general, the way the Millennium Development Goals are going to get communicated in this country is around the specific outcomes, and that there will need to be sub-campaigns, one on maternal and child health, and one on gender, and one on education, and so on and so forth, where you can tell Americans what are the concrete results specifically that they can count on and hold people accountable for and get their arms around. Because in terms of marketing poverty alleviation country by country, you really find different national audiences are looking for different value propositions. And Americans really want to be able to put their hands on the individual child or the particular bednet or the concrete educational curriculum and not the general principles. So we didn't have Make Poverty History here in the U.S., and we're not going to have it, but we do have the One campaign, which I'll talk about a little bit more, on whose board I sit. And that's our version of mobilizing more of the U.S. public and more of the Congress and the executive branch to encourage the United States to take more of a leadership role on these outcomes. But it was great to see that broad goal out there and literally on every wall. But there is still a question. Is it a lie that will potentially get people's hopes up only to dash them, or is it a realistic, achievable goal that can be delivered on? Well, first of all, let me say a little bit about how I'm going to define poverty, because you can't talk about making poverty history, I would think, without saying, what do you mean? And there are lots of different definitions. There's the $1 a day definition. There's the $2 a day definition. There's the self-sustaining economic growth definition. And there are the social indicators definitions. And certainly from my point of view and the Save the Children point of view, poverty is when life is nasty, brutish, and short, and not potentially all the other definitions. But as you all know, there are between 1.3 and 1.5 billion people for whom life is nasty, brutish, and short. And what does it mean, first of all, to move down from those words? Number one, it means life expectancy is about 40 years as compared to the 77 years in the United States and Europe. So it means 33 years less of life. Secondly, it means that when you reach adulthood, and for the few years of adulthood you have, you'll have 8 or 9 children. And of those, 3 or 4 will die before the age of 6. And by the end of the day today, 30,000 children around the world will have died from preventable causes for the lack of literally the pennies a day that we talk about at Save the Children. Every single day, 7 days a week, 365 days out of the year, year after year after year. Thirdly, it means that you will be sick in one form or another with more or less severity every single day of your life. You know, we have a day or two of sickness per year, maybe, in most cases. But if you're one of these 1.3 billion people, you never know what it's like not to have diarrhea. You'll go your whole life, basically, with diarrhea. Most days you'll have a respiratory infection. Most years you'll have a malaria bout. And then several other maladies along the way, that any one of which might kill you, but you'll be sick all the time. Thirdly, you'll be hungry. When you were in the womb, your mother would have been malnourished. You won't have enough to eat during your earlier years. You'll be stunted. Your brain will not be at its full level of development, and you'll be hungry all the time. Fifth, you won't know how to read or write, so you'll never have any real way of absorbing anything that's going on beyond your immediate environment. And as I said, you'll be dead by 40, living every day under these circumstances. So it is beyond tragedy that in a world that knows how to resolve all of these issues and has the delivery systems and resources and capacity to make this set of things go away pretty easily, in fact, by 2020, that it's not happening. And I will say to all of you, as Eduardo Mondlane said to me, this is actually going to take most of your lifetimes to really put to bed. And you won't find any more rewarding thing to do and any more relevant thing to do than to really work on finishing this job. So I do think, for any of you that are interested, and I'll go a little bit more into this in the career portion, you won't have a more important and relevant and meaningful set of activities than to get involved in this package of issues. Not that there aren't a lot of other good things to do. I don't want to suggest that, but this is another one of them. So that's what poverty is. Sickness, hunger, abuse, illiteracy, marginalization, and despair. And actually, a year or two ago, the World Bank did, because in fact NGOs were pushing them, did a study of how the poor felt about being poor. And over again, they felt even more pain at the marginalization and discrimination than they did about the hunger and disease and illiteracy. So that's another whole piece of this. So when I talk about poverty, that's what I'm talking about. Being sick, being hungry, being illiterate, being marginal. on the one hand, in the 1960s, 80% of all the people in the world lived this way. So 80% of the entire human population was hungry, sick, illiterate, and with a 40-year life expectancy. And if that was still the case today, we'd be talking about over 5 billion people who would be living in absolute poverty. So there have been unbelievable improvements in these outcomes over the past 30 years. And billions of people who would be living under these conditions are not living under these conditions. And in the 1960s and the 1970s, basically there were a relatively few rich people and countries, the United States and Western Europe, maybe Japan to a certain extent, and then everybody else was poor everywhere. So everyone in East Asia, everyone in Latin America and the Caribbean, everyone in the Middle East, everyone in South Asia, everybody was living under these conditions. And certainly what's happened over this past generation is the spectrum of circumstances has widened dramatically. So you have 20% living in these conditions, but then you have 20% in the next level, and 20% in the next level, and 20% in the next level. And in places like Latin America and the Middle East, well, first of all, in East Asia, obviously people have 75-year life expectancies in South Korea and Taiwan and Thailand and Malaysia and so on, as compared to the 40 years it was when I was here in Middlebury. And in Latin America and the Middle East, people are living to 65 or 68 and so on. So in my own experience, there's a real distinction between the conditions I described on the one hand and being healthy, being literate, being safe, and having enough to eat. That's a huge moral dividing line, even though it may be an unhappy experience not to have more than that. If you have those things, you have what I have come to believe is most important. And then you can move on from there however you might. But if you're down in that 1.4 billion that is in these terrible conditions, that's a whole different ballgame. So billions have moved out of those conditions. My first stint overseas, out of Middlebury in the 70s, was in East Asia, and in Thailand and Malaysia and South Korea. And these countries had the same conditions that Mali basically has today. And the same 45-year life expectancy, the same mass illiteracy, the same stunting, and so on and so forth. And in one generation, these countries have gone from the fifth world to the first world. And in the last 10 years, it's happened in Vietnam. And you go to these countries, and the grandmothers and grandfathers are 4 feet 6 or 5 feet and stunted and illiterate, and their daughters and sons have university degrees and are 6 feet and are macroeconomists and so on and so forth. And in Vietnam today, that's the case. I mean, we have big women's microenterprise programs in Vietnam and have about 50 young women, kind of 25 to 35, and they're all university graduates in economics, and their mothers are all illiterate, sick, stunted people working in a rice paddy. So this can all happen, not only from one generation to the next, but literally almost from 1 year to the next if everything falls into place. And more often it has been falling into place. So when we talk about absolute poverty today, 90% of it is either in sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia. So conditions may be difficult and people may be poor in Latin America or East Asia or the Middle East. But people have enough to eat, they live to be 65 or 70, they can read and write, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I'm making that particular distinction. So making poverty history, by these definitions, is really basically a focus on sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, and to some extent rural China. If you talk about the 1.3 billion, 1.4 billion people living in absolute poverty, 40% or so live in India and China. And there are as many absolutely poor people in those two countries as in sub-Saharan Africa combined. I say that because it's not always recognized how many poor people there are in those two places. And if poverty can be more or less eliminated in those two countries, then a huge piece of the 1.4 billion would be taken care of. You take 500 million plus sort of off the situation and move them to a better place. And that's probably going to happen in the next 10 or 15 years, kind of regardless of what any of us do to a large extent. Because the national goals and the foreign policy goals and the economic goals of those the political leaderships of those countries are quite inclined to reducing absolute poverty in those two countries. We, as I mentioned, Allison had been working with the leadership in India on maternal and child health and reducing their unbelievably high rural under 5 mortality rates. And with Indira Gandhi and the Prime Minister and the Minister of Health and so on and so forth. And they are now putting an extra $1 billion a year of their own funds into rural maternal and child health. And in certain sense, we haven't had to put a penny of your donations or Save the Children contributors into that. But that's double our annual budget worldwide that the government of India is now putting into its rural health programs. And if they continue to do that for the next 15 years, they will basically eliminate 75 or 80% of all their under 5 mortality and maternal mortality. So that's and in China, it's definitely going to get done. They're already on the way to doing it. So rural mortality, which is still hundreds of millions of people, is almost certain by 2015 to be taken care of. India, the question is as I look at it, it's going to be about caste and about gender. Because 90% of the hungry and illiterate are low caste and women and girls. And those are not just government attitudes, those are also, they have deep cultural roots in the society, particularly in rural society. So that will be the challenge in India. But there's a real possibility that will get dealt with. So then the issues of making poverty history are going to be Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and sub-Saharan Africa. And there, the tasks are, I think, going to be more challenging. And I do think this, probably inevitably and naturally enough, this last 20% is going to be much harder than the first 20% was. In other words, it was a lot easier to produce structural change in Korea and Taiwan and Malaysia and Thailand and Vietnam than it is in Mali and Congo and Zimbabwe, for a lot of reasons of soils and culture and so on, history. So for those of you who do pursue this work, I think your coming 40 years will be tougher than my last 40 years were. Because I, in lots of ways, hardly had to do much of anything in the countries that I've mentioned. They were probably going to advance whether anyone was doing much of anything or not. And to state the obvious about making poverty history, we're not going to do it. Those of us in this room are going to do nothing else but lend a helping hand from time to time. Individuals have to do it, families have to do it, households have to do it, villages have to do it first and foremost. But obviously, change has to be introduced, education has to be introduced, and then so national governments are obviously going to then have to take a leading role. And if the government of India decides it's not interested in the bottom 700 million people, it won't matter what any of us do or how much money the World Bank sends, nothing will change. But having said that, then, if you've got a population that is really oriented to education and health and nutrition and change, and you've got a government that wants to help them do that, in lots of cases there simply there's not the technology and the capital to do the job. So typically you need all of these things. And by the way, we have been underwriting the economic development of South Korea for 55 years. And we have put tens of billions of dollars into South Korea. Let's just take that example. So it was not only hard work and an orientation to education, the Confucian ethic and all the rest, but it was getting billions of dollars of investment capital from the outside. And Taiwan the same, and Thailand the same, and so on and so forth. So it does take outside assistance. On the one hand, we have the Millennium Development Goals on economic growth, on maternal and child health, on gender equity, on basic education, on HIV/AIDS, et cetera, et cetera. There are plans for each one of those goals right down to the provincial level in every country in the world. We know exactly what has to be done, who has to do it, and how much it's going to cost. It's going to take about $100 billion a year more than is currently being put into those goals, into primary health, maternal and child health, HIV/AIDS, economic growth, agriculture, education, and so on. And of that $100 billion, about $50 billion needs to come from the countries themselves. So that Nigeria and Pakistan and Congo need to reallocate $50 billion that they're currently spending towards education and health and gender equity and so on and so forth, agriculture, which they have. They have the money. It's just going into other things. And then the U.S., Europe, and Japan have to put up the other $50 billion. And the rule is that the U.S. puts up 25% and the rest of the world puts up 75%. So the U.S. Needs to put up $12.5 billion, and then the Europeans and the Japanese put up the rest. So that's what's needed. And if that was done every year between now and 2020, you would eliminate 90% of all the malnutrition, hunger, disease, illiteracy, abuse. The absolute poverty. And it's not just about the money, it is about the focus and prioritization and political will. And it won't happen, none of it will happen, if in fact the U.S. president doesn't decide that this should be a priority, the way Tony Blair has decided it should be a priority. And Gordon Brown has decided it would be a priority because, rightly or wrongly, when the U.S. speaks and steps up to the plate and says something is a priority and puts all the levers we have behind what we care about, things happen. And as much as we would wish it wasn't so, by and large, if the U.S. is not behind something, it does not become a major reality. And if the U.S. is behind something, it may not become a major reality, but this could be, because most other people in the world really want to see this happen anyway, so I think they would be extremely, not only happy, but reinforcing if for the next 8 or 10 years, whichever American president went to the G8 said, eliminating absolute poverty is one of America's 3 most important global priorities. The $12.5 billion isn't even chump change. So this is not a deficit problem or a fiscal irresponsibility problem. I mean, this is a month's expenditure in Iraq, and it is irrelevant to our economic circumstances. So this is not economically or fiscally difficult to do, and you wouldn't have to do it all at once. So I do think a U.S. president, if they played it right, could have a successful issue. And certainly the other people at the G8 meetings, not to mention everyone in the South, I think would look at the U.S. in a whole different way if for the next 15 years the U.S. was saying every day in every way, we want to see this happen. So I also think personally it would improve our national security and individual security conditions. And that then, if all these things happen, poverty would be history by 2020, by and large. I mean, there'd still be the last 350, 400 million, and that would be really tough, and those people would be scattered and so on and so. But basically, the real job would be over. Is it likely to happen that completely? No. Is it likely to happen more than has been the case over the past 10 or 15 years? Probably. But in fact, that really depends on all of you and hundreds of thousands of people like you and other hundreds of thousands of people. Because certainly a U.S. president and members of Congress and so on and so forth don't have a lot of immediate support for advocating that the U.S. take a leading role in making poverty history. And they can expect a lot of grief from a lot of people. And, we've all heard that too. And if I were a senator from most states other than Vermont, but if I was a senator from Alabama or Texas or other places, and I said, I want to put even 1% more of your tax dollars into foreign assistance, my opponent in the next election would absolutely say, here we are, with school problems and police problems and national security problems, and my opponent is wanting to give our money away to a bunch of corrupt dictators and unaccountable NGOs. So politicians don't have the political support I shouldn't say the political support, not to, or get in front of this, but it's not an exciting proposition at the moment in terms of citizens. I mean, Angela Merkel and Tony Blair can talk about it and put it on the agenda and know 25% of their electorate is going to be wildly enthusiastic and the rest aren't going to be very unhappy. And that is absolutely not the case here in the United States. And people do say, we got more than enough problems right here in our own community, in our own state. We have lousy schools and inadequate policing and deteriorating infrastructure and poor health care and no Social Security and so on and so forth. Why would we be spending our hard-earned money on a bunch of foreigners when we haven't dealt with our issues right here in Middlebury, Vermont? So politicians need more cover. 2 or 3 years ago, I had a meeting with President Bush on after-school programs in the United States. But I did say this was just after the Monterey Summit and the announcement of the Millennium Challenge accounts, maybe 5 months after that. I said, Mr. President, I'd really like to thank you for committing $5 billion a year to the Millennium Challenge account. And by the way, that's basically a good idea, because the idea was to create incentives for Southern partners to do their part of the equation and put funds into health and education and deal with corruption and opportunity and transparency. Because, again, you can pour money into Zimbabwe and you're still not going to get anywhere. So it wasn't a bad idea. It was a good idea. So I said thanks, as one would. And he said, well, thank you. In 5 months, you're the first person that's ever said anything to me about the Millennium Challenge account. So you do have to say, all of us who care about these issues, it's not the smartest thing in the world not to reward people when they do what you'd like them to do, even in the most simple kind of way, like saying thank you for doing this, even though there might be other things we don't like as much. And that could have been Bill Clinton. It could be anybody. So I mean, that's the only point is if you get out in front on spending, U.S. dollars and prestige on making poverty history. Right now, the equation doesn't provide you with a huge amount of support. So really, kind of getting as far out on the positive side of this as possible really means what the mid-8 folks are doing and others are doing really has to be sustained. And of the 20% of the world's population that are living in absolute poverty today, by 2020, that number, that percent, will either be 15 or 16%, or it can be 7 or 8%. So we can either be talking about 1.4 billion people yet again because of population growth, or we can be talking about 500 or 600 million people. That's a big difference for that billion people in the middle. And the jury is still out. Now, history would say, as I said, it's likely to be better than 18%, and 1.4 billion, maybe it'll be 1.1 billion or 1 billion, and good for those 400 million who would have been sick, but not so good for the billion who still will be. And when I started this work, there were 30,000 children dying needlessly every day, and to this day there are still 30,000 because of the population growth. So I've been doing all this work, getting up early, going to bed late, flying to difficult places, only to have 30,000 children die the next day anyway. So it would be great to kind of really break the back on that number once and for all. And that is not a technological problem. It's not a lack of capital. It's not an absence of delivery systems. It's political will. And it's political will both in the southern countries because unaccountability and corruption and militarization and so on also have to change. But it is going to take support from the world that has the resources. And that's going to take you and lots of other people like you really caring about this. And it doesn't really actually matter whether you're an investment banker or a social worker or a lawyer or a doctor or somebody that's working on it full time. You can still help make it happen so long as you stay interested, call your member of Congress, give lectures, do all the things that make this a more important issue than it is today. So in 2020, will we look back and say, essentially, we made poverty history? It's really up to you. Thank you very much.
We now have about 7 minutes for questions, so please, the floor is open. Do you want to call on people or shall I?
No, I'm able to do that. Thanks.
Well, thank you for your speech. That was wonderful. You mentioned political will several times and divided the $100 billion more
Right.
the Western nations plus Japan and the other 50 from within the countries themselves. And I was just wondering how much of how long is the first step of actually providing either democratic assistance or just, you mentioned Colombia's program of inviting, sponsoring people who would return the leaders in countries that need it. How long, it's part of it, I think, is a simultaneous process, but also how long would it take or how much money of that 50 billion internally or 50 billion external should go into building accountable political structures that aren't going to impede the militarization or corruption that exists and prevents humanitarian aid from getting to where it needs to go?
I would say directly not a huge amount because I don't think it produces the results. I think setting up the incentives that say we are going to really put lots and lots of funding into those countries that have already made the decision to go into transparency and openness and so on and so forth will solve 15% of the problem every 2 or 3 years just there anyway, just by taking the low-hanging fruit in the countries that have already more or less decided to go this way. And I think if that's happening for several years, it's going to put enormous new pressure on a lot of countries that aren't right now interested in doing it. And as citizens in those countries say, hey, Ghana's now really moved forward, or Bolivia's moved forward, what's going on here? Secondly, I think you can put, because that's not all you want to do. You always have to do other things in other countries. And I do think, most countries are perfectly happy to have education extended and so on and so forth. And I think until people can read and write and can understand what's going on and so on and so forth, you're very unlikely to get accountable governments anyway. I behave very honestly because I know every person, say the children, is watching every move I make and every receipt I send in, and they're really smart, active people. And if I did anything, they would be all over me. Connie Chung would be all over me, etc. So therefore, in spite of my evil disposition, I've decided it's in my self-interest to hand in truthful trip expense reports, etc., etc. So I don't think, the point is, in general, until citizens are at least reasonably capable of holding their leaders accountable, the leaders are going to take advantage. Every now and then you get a saint like Eduardo Mondlane, but there have been a lot of his followers who have been in Mozambique have been the most corrupt people in the world because you had 90% illiteracy in Mozambique, so people were in no position to know what was going on, so they got taken advantage of. So I do think, but these countries are generally happy to see big investments made in education, even because they haven't really themselves made the connection that this could be, at the end of the day, their own demise. So creating the incentive system with those that have, for whatever reasons, already decided to go this way, and then creating the educational base that allows people to understand what's going on and know what they need to do to take action. And I do think what NGOs do is actually pretty useful here, meaning we really do empower people. We have something like, we have over 1 million volunteers at the village level, who get asked what do they want to do, how much money are we going to spend. Here, we report to them how the money is being spent from top to bottom, so they have experiences in what transparent decision-making and life can look like. And so I think actually, going back to how do you spend the money, spending it on village NGOs and national NGOs and partnerships with international NGOs is another good thing.
Just to take it a step further, if you look at 20 developments to occur somewhere, especially in the third world or the underdeveloped world, political stability is the first prerequisite.
Right.
And to get political stability, the only solution would be a stronger state. Now, in those countries, what happens is there are institutions or NGOs, they rebel, that they actually, either they come from outside or they are internally from the same country. They become a parallel structure
Well, certainly something I've learned over the years is people's number one priority is safety and security and for their children. I mean, if they have to decide, even between being hungry and illiterate and abused and dead, they'll take the former. And until people have security, it's literally impossible to move on to other things. They don't happen anyway. So I have become much more aware that the right police and the right military and so on and so forth is really crucial. And on that part, therefore. And so governments making sure that they have honest, reliable, professional police and military is really crucial. And secondly, you certainly do have to invest in strengthening state institutions. And certainly at Save the Children, probably 2/3 or 3/4 of what we do is strengthening government capacity. Having said that, I'm also convinced you need a balance between civil society, NGOs, and government, because if you get a completely state-centric system without checks and balances, then in my experience, all the bad things I've talked about, taking advantage of others, are going to happen. So you need both. You need a strong governmental system, and you need a strong civil society system. Hopefully, NGOs are trying to do both. And certainly in our case, we are. I mean, we work more often. I mentioned the India case. I mean, in India, we're essentially working only with the government.
One more question.
You mentioned at one point during your talk that one of the most odious things when asked that the poor were dealing with is marginalization. And despite absolute poverty having fallen over the past several decades, the gap between rich and poor has grown by statistic. How do you feel? Do you feel that this is a problem in terms of addressing issues of marginalization? And if so, how do you go about addressing the gap?
I don't know whether I'd agree that the gap has grown, in the sense that there are all these intermediate segments between the rich and the poor, worldwide and within a lot of countries. So, but between the top 20% and the bottom 20%, it's certainly grown. There are a bunch of other people somewhere in the middle. And so whether that mitigates the sense of hopelessness and being discriminated against or not, I don't know. And I certainly would say that when you have an enormous gap, it is enormously demoralizing. And I think it, in lots of ways, is psychologically generally more difficult to be in the poorest 15% in the United States than it is to be poor in Africa, because in Africa 80% are poor, so at least you feel like you're in a big boat with an awful lot of other people. Whereas here, the research shows lots of people blame themselves for their plight rather than, because here I am, I'm only 20%, look at how many people are living better, it must be my fault. Even though, as a matter of fact, in general, these people are as remote from help as you would be if you were in Africa. So, what do you do about that? In some ways, you would. It's kind of not my focus, in a certain sense, because once you live to be 65 and are illiterate, that's what I work on, and I'm only trying to get those people up to the next 20%. And also, I do it that way because that job that I've described is actually much easier than dealing, with psychological marginalization in otherwise relatively resource-rich countries. So I I apologize for not answering your question, but I probably don't know anything more about the answer than anybody else in the room does. I think, other than to say, I think it's much more difficult than providing newborn mortality reduction and basic literacy. And I think you're right. I think it is equally devastating and psychologically more devastating to be poor in a resource-rich country with nobody that cares than otherwise. So I think you're right, and I don't have the answer.
For those of you interested in staying on for the career conversation portion of this program, we'll reconvene in just a few moments. Rohatyn has one quick announcement, and then we'll thank our speakers for a wonderful session. Rohatyn, quickly.
I'll just do quickly announce as it's at 4:30 p.m. here in Rash. It's Mr. John Sifton from Human Rights Watch. He's going to talk about the human rights situation in Afghanistan. So all welcome.
So obviously relevant to this audience, but please join me in thanking